She sat in that cell, clutching a diary that could save her life, but no one knew she was too afraid to show it to them. The morning sun had not yet broken over the ridge when they finished building the gallows in the center of Tombstone Creek. The wooden platform stood like a judgment against the pale sky, its crossbeam casting a long shadow that reached all the way to the jailhouse steps. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell watched from his office window as the carpenter tested the rope one final time, the hemp making a sound like dried bones when it stretched taut. In the cell behind him, Elena Vargas sat on the narrow cot with her back pressed against the stone wall. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers wrapped around something small and leather-bound that she kept hidden beneath the folds of her worn black dress. She had not spoken a word since they brought her in 3 days ago, not even to proclaim her innocence or beg for mercy. The silence hung around her like morning mist, thick and impenetrable. Caldwell turned from the window and studied her through the iron bars. She was younger than he had expected when they first dragged her from the cabin where Miguel Vargas had made his last stand. Her dark hair was streaked with dust and hung loose around her shoulders, and her brown eyes held depths he could not read. The town had painted her as a black widow, a woman who had aided her husband in his reign of terror across 3 counties. But looking at her now, Caldwell saw only exhaustion and something that looked almost like relief. "Mrs. Vargas," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. "Is there anything you want to say? Anything at all?" She looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his for the first time since her capture. For a moment, he thought she might speak, might offer some defense or explanation that would make his job easier. But she only shook her head slightly and looked down at her hands again, her fingers tightening around whatever she held hidden there. Outside, the sounds of the waking town drifted through the barred windows. Voices carried on the morning air, excited and hungry for the justice they believed was coming. Caldwell had been sheriff of Tombstone Creek for 20 years, had seen his share of hangings, and heard his share of final confessions. But something about this woman troubled him in ways he could not name. Miguel Black Snake Vargas had been a plague on the territory for 5 years, robbing banks and stages, leaving a trail of bodies from here to the Colorado border. When the posse finally cornered him in that cabin up the creek, he had fought like a demon before a rifle bullet found its mark. They had expected to find gold, weapons, maybe other gang members. Instead, they found only Elena, cowering in the corner while her husband's blood spread across the cabin. The evidence against her seemed clear enough. She had lived with the man, shared his bed, cooked his meals. The law said a wife was responsible for her husband's crimes if she had aided him, and what other explanation could there be for her presence? The town wanted blood for all the suffering Miguel had caused, and if they could not have his, they would settle for hers. But doubt gnawed at Caldwell like hunger. Something in her eyes, in the way she held herself, did not fit the picture of a willing accomplice. He had seen guilt before, had watched it twist faces and break voices. Elena Vargas carried weight, but it did not feel like the weight of crimes committed. It felt like the weight of secrets carried too long. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the sounds of preparation. Hammer blows echoed as someone built benches for the spectators. Children's voices rose and fell as they played at hangings behind the general store. The whole town buzzed with anticipation, as if they were preparing for a carnival instead of an execution. Elena had not moved from her position against the wall, had not asked for water or food or even a Bible. She simply sat there, holding whatever she clutched in her hands and staring at some point on the floor that only she could see. The morning light filtering through the barred window caught the dust motes dancing in the air around her, and for a moment she looked almost ghostly, as if she might fade away before the rope could claim her. "Elena," Caldwell said, using her first name this time, hoping familiarity might crack her silence. "That thing in your hands. What is it?" She looked up at him again, and this time he saw fear flash across her features. Not the fear of death, he had seen that often enough to recognize it, but the fear of something being taken away. Her hands moved slightly, and he caught a glimpse of worn leather, the edge of what looked like a small book. "It's nothing," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Just nothing." But the way she said it, the way her entire body tensed, as if preparing to protect whatever she held, told Caldwell it was anything but nothing. He stepped closer to the bars, close enough to see the exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes, close enough to smell the dust and fear that clung to her like a second skin. "Mrs. Vargas," he said gently, "in a few hours, those people out there are going to want to see justice done. They've been hurt by your husband's crimes, and they believe you were part of it all. If there's something, anything, that might help me understand what really happened, now will be the time to share it." Elena's grip tightened on the hidden object. She looked toward the window where the sounds of the growing crowd could be heard, then back at Caldwell. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hammering and the whisper of wind through the bars. "Sheriff," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what if the truth was worse than the lie? What if knowing it would hurt more people than hanging me ever could?" The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a dying fire. Caldwell studied her face, saw the anguish there, and felt his certainty begin to crumble like old adobe in the rain. As the morning sun climbed higher and the shadow of the gallows grew shorter, Elena Vargas closed her eyes and pressed the leather-bound secret closer to her heart, while somewhere in the growing crowd outside, voices began to call for justice that might not be justice at all. The sheriff thought he was reading the confession of a killer's wife, until he realized every page was evidence that could have saved innocent lives. The crowd outside grew restless as the afternoon wore on. Caldwell could hear them through the jailhouse walls, voices rising and falling like wind through canyon rocks. Some called for Elena to be brought out early. Others demanded to know why justice was taking so long. The sheriff had sent his deputy home hours ago, claiming he needed time alone to prepare the final paperwork. In truth, he could not shake the image of Elena's face when she spoke of truths that might hurt more than lies. As evening shadows stretched across the cell floor, Elena finally fell asleep on the narrow cot, her back against the wall and her arms wrapped protectively around her middle. The mysterious object she had clutched all day was nowhere to be seen. Caldwell watched her for a long moment, noting how young she looked in sleep, how the lines of fear and exhaustion softened into something almost peaceful. It was then he noticed it, a loose floorboard near the corner of her cell, one edge slightly raised as if it had been disturbed recently. His 20 years of keeping the peace had taught him to notice such things, small signs that spoke of secrets hidden and desperate measures taken. Moving quietly, Caldwell unlocked the cell door. The hinges whispered their protest, but Elena did not stir. He knelt beside the loose board and worked it free with his knife, the old wood giving way with barely a sound. Beneath it, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a small leather-bound book no bigger than his palm. He returned to his desk before opening it, positioning the oil lamp so its light fell across the pages. Elena's handwriting was delicate but sure, each letter carefully formed as if the act of writing itself was precious to her. The first entry was dated 3 years ago, just after her marriage to Miguel Vargas. "He brought me flowers today, wild roses from the creek bottom, said they reminded him of my mother's garden back in Santa Fe. I wanted to believe the gentleness I saw in his eyes when he gave them to me. I wanted to believe it would last." Caldwell turned the page, and the entries that followed painted a picture that made his chest tighten with understanding. Elena's words revealed a woman who had discovered too late that she had married a man capable of terrible things, but who was too afraid to leave and too powerless to stop him. Miguel came home with blood on his shirt again. When I asked about it, he said it was from butchering a deer. But there was no meat, and his eyes held that emptiness I have learned to fear. I pretend to believe him because the alternative terrifies me more than the lies. Page after page chronicled not the crimes of an accomplice, but the desperate documentation of a witness. Elena had recorded every robbery, every killing, every cruel act she had learned about through overheard conversations and blood-stained evidence. But more than that, She had tried to help where she could. I saw Mrs. Patterson in town today. Her husband is one of the men Miguel is planning to rob next week when he makes a supply run to Tucson. I could not tell her directly, but I managed to mention that the road has been dangerous lately, that perhaps Mr. Patterson should delay his trip or take a different route. She looked at me strangely, but I think she understood. God help me, I pray she understood. Caldwell's hands trembled slightly as he turned another page. The entries grew more desperate as time passed, Elena's neat handwriting sometimes broken by what looked like tear stains. 3 men died in the bank robbery yesterday. Miguel laughed when he told me about it, said they should have known better than to play hero. I wanted to scream, to strike him, to run away into the desert and never come back. Instead, I smiled and served him supper. I am becoming someone I do not recognize, and I fear what that person might be capable of. But it was not just fear that filled the pages. As Caldwell read deeper, he discovered that Elena had been gathering evidence, recording names and dates and locations with the methodical care of someone building a case. She had been planning something, preparing for a moment when she might find the courage to act. I have been in contact with Sheriff Morrison in Prescott through Sarah Hendricks. She carries my letters when she visits her sister there. I cannot sign my name or say where I am, but I have told him about the Cave Creek hideout and the planned raid on the mining payroll. If he acts on the information, maybe some good can come from my cowardice. Maybe some lives can be saved. The revelation hit Caldwell like a physical blow. Sheriff Morrison had indeed raided the Cave Creek hideout 6 months ago, capturing 2 of Miguel's men and recovering stolen gold that had been returned to its rightful owners. The raid had been based on an anonymous tip, one Morrison had mentioned in their correspondence but never elaborated on. Elena had been the source. She had been fighting Miguel's crimes in the only way available to her, using her position in his household to gather intelligence and pass it along through a network of women who understood the danger she faced. The diary revealed at least 4 occasions when her warnings had prevented robberies or saved lives. Miguel suspects something. He has been watching me more closely, asking questions about my trips to town. Yesterday, he found one of my letters before I could send it. I told him it was to my sister in San Antonio, a lie that seemed to satisfy him. But I saw something in his eyes that chills me to the bone. I must be more careful. If he discovers what I have been doing. The entry ended there, the sentence unfinished, as if Elena had been interrupted while writing. The next few entries were sporadic, written in a hand that shook with fear. He hit me today, said I had been acting strange, that he did not trust strange behavior from anyone, especially his wife. The bruise on my face will heal, but something inside me broke that may never mend. I understand now that I will never be free of him while he lives. The only question is whether I will survive long enough to see him face justice for his crimes. Caldwell closed the diary and sat back in his chair, feeling as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Outside, the crowd was still calling for Elena's blood, still convinced they knew the truth about the woman sleeping in his cell. But the truth was written in ink and tears on the pages before him. Elena Vargas was not Miguel's accomplice. She was his victim, his prisoner, and perhaps the closest thing to a hero this godforsaken territory had seen in years. The final entry in the diary was dated just 2 days before Miguel's death. The handwriting was rushed, desperate. Miguel is planning something terrible. I heard him talking to Red Carson about hitting the school wagon next week when it carries the children from the mining camps. He said there would be no witnesses this time, that children were easier to control than adults. I cannot let this happen. I will not let this happen. If I must die to stop him, then so be it. But I will not have the blood of innocents on my hands along with everything else I have failed to prevent. Below that, in different ink, as if written later, were the words that made Caldwell's throat tighten with emotion. If anyone reads this, please know that I tried. Please know that I was not the monster they will paint me to be. And please, if there is any justice in this world, let my death mean something more than revenge. Caldwell looked toward the cell where Elena slept, her face peaceful in the lamplight. Tomorrow morning, unless he found the courage to act, They would hang a woman who had risked everything to save the lives of children she had never met. They would execute someone whose only crime was being too weak to escape and too brave to stop fighting. As the night deepened around them, the sheriff sat with Elena's diary open before him, wondering if the truth really was worse than the lie, and whether he had the strength to face a town hungry for blood with nothing but ink and paper to feed them. He had the evidence to save her life in his hands, but the whole town was gathered outside, demanding blood for crimes she never committed. The church bell rang 4 times, marking the hour before dawn. Caldwell had not slept. He sat at his desk with Elena's diary open before him, reading her words again by the flickering light of the oil lamp. Each page felt heavier than the last, weighted with a truth that could either save her life or destroy what little peace this town had managed to build. Outside, he could hear them gathering already. Voices drifted through the morning darkness, excited and expectant. Someone had brought coffee and biscuits, turning the execution into a social event. Children laughed as they played between the adults' legs, too young to understand what they were witnessing, too old to be sent away from what the grown-ups called justice. Elena stirred on her cot, then sat up slowly, her dark hair falling across her face like a curtain. She looked toward the window where the first pale threads of dawn were beginning to show, then at Caldwell behind his desk. "You found it," she said quietly. It was not a question. Caldwell nodded, his throat tight. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you show this to anyone?" Elena rose from the cot and moved to the bars, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. In the lamplight, he could see the purple shadow of an old bruise along her jawline, faded but still visible. "Because it wouldn't have mattered," she said. "Look out there, Sheriff. Listen to them. They don't want truth. They want blood, Miguel's blood, and since they can't have that, they'll settle for mine." "But this proves I was married to a monster," Elena interrupted, her voice steady but filled with exhaustion. "It proves I lived with him, cooked for him, shared his bed. In their eyes, that makes me guilty of everything he did, no matter what I wrote in some little book." Caldwell stood and approached the cell, the diary clutched in his hands. "Elena, this shows you try to stop him. It shows you save lives. Mrs. Patterson's husband never made that supply run because you warned her. The Cave Creek raid happened because of information you provided. You were fighting him in the only way you could. And how many died while I was gathering evidence?" Her voice broke slightly. "How many people suffered while I was too afraid to run, too weak to fight, too cowardly to do what needed to be done?" "You weren't cowardly," Caldwell said fiercely. "You were trapped. And you did more to stop Miguel Vargas than any lawman in 3 territories." Elena's laugh was bitter as desert wind. "Tell that to the families of the men who died in the Broken Arrow bank robbery. Tell that to the widow of the stage driver Miguel shot for sport. Tell them how brave I was while their husbands bled out in the dust." Through the window, the crowd's voices grew louder. Someone was building up the fire under a coffee pot, the flames casting dancing shadows on the jailhouse walls. The sound of boots on wooden planks echoed as people climbed the viewing benches someone had constructed around the gallows. "There's something else," Elena said quietly, her fingers gripping the iron bars. "Something I never wrote down because I was too ashamed." Caldwell waited, knowing from her tone that whatever came next would cut deeper than anything he had already learned. "The night before they cornered Miguel at the cabin, I had the chance to leave. Sarah Hendricks offered to take me with her when she fled to her sister in Prescott. She had a wagon, supplies, enough money to get us both far away from here." Elena's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I almost went. I packed my few things, wrote a letter to leave for Miguel, even walked as far as the creek where she was waiting." "What stopped you?" "I heard him talking to Red Carson about the school wagon. About the children." She closed her eyes, her knuckles white against the bars. "I realized that if I ran, if I disappeared, he would know someone had betrayed him. He would change his plans, be more careful, harder to track. Those children would die because I chose to save myself." The weight of her confession settled over them like dust. Caldwell understood now why she had asked if the truth might be worse than the lie. Elena had chosen to stay, knowing it likely meant her death, because leaving would have meant the deaths of innocents. So I went back, she continued, unpacked my things, burned the letter, and waited for whatever was coming. I had sent word to you about Miguel's location through Sarah before she left. I knew the posse would come eventually. I just hoped. I hoped it would be soon enough. And when we came, Miguel knew he was trapped. He said if he was going to die, he was taking me with him. Said no one would ever know I had betrayed him if we both died in that cabin. Elena opened her eyes and looked directly at Caldwell. When your bullet found him instead of me, I thought maybe God had decided I deserved a chance to live. But I was wrong. All I did was trade one death for another. The church bell rang again, marking the half hour. Outside, the crowd was growing restless. Someone called out asking when the hanging would begin, and the voices that answered carried ugly eagerness. Elena, Caldwell said carefully, if I take this diary out there, if I read it to them, some might listen. Some might understand. She shook her head. And the others? The ones who've already made up their minds? The ones who lost family to Miguel's guns? You think they'll care about my good intentions when they're looking at the woman who shared his bed? But we have to try. We can't let them hang you for crimes you didn't commit. Can't we? Elena's smile was sad and knowing. Sheriff, you've worn that badge for 20 years. You know how this works. The law isn't about truth. It's about what people can live with. And this town can live with hanging Miguel Vargas's widow a lot easier than they can live with admitting they were wrong about. Through the window, the first full rays of sunlight painted the gallows in golden light. The crossbeam stood stark against the morning sky, the ropes swaying gently in the desert wind. People were moving toward the platform now, claiming the best viewing spots, their faces bright with anticipation. There's another choice, Caldwell said slowly, his voice barely audible. I could let you go. Say you overpowered me, took my keys. By the time I recovered, you could be hours away. Elena studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the struggle there, the war between duty and conscience. And then what? She asked. I spend the rest of my life running, looking over my shoulder, knowing that somewhere behind me, people believe I helped murder their friends and family. She shook her head. That's not living, Sheriff. That's just another kind of prison. So what do you want me to do? Elena was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on something beyond the barred window. When she spoke, her voice carried a strange kind of peace. I want you to do whatever you can live with, she said. If that means reading my diary to a crowd that doesn't want to hear it, then read it. If that means letting me face the rope with the truth still locked inside these walls, then lock it away. But whatever you choose, know that I don't blame you for it. You didn't put me in this cell, Sheriff. I put myself here the day I said yes to a marriage proposal from a man whose eyes held too many shadows. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the sound of footsteps on the jailhouse porch. A knock echoed through the building, followed by a voice Caldwell recognized as belonging to Judge Harlan. Sheriff Caldwell? It's time. Elena straightened her shoulders and smoothed her dress with hands that trembled only slightly. She looked at Caldwell one last time, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but something that looked almost like gratitude. Thank you, she said quietly, for reading my words, for seeing me as more than just his wife. Whatever happens next, that means everything to me. As the voices outside grew louder and the moment of decision arrived, Caldwell clutched Elena's diary against his chest and wondered if he had the courage to choose truth over peace, justice over comfort, and whether one woman's life was worth the price of a town's certainty about good and evil. When the sheriff opened that diary in front of the whole town, he had no idea that a dead woman's words were about to save a living one's life. The crowd had grown larger than Caldwell had ever seen for an execution. Nearly the entire population of Tombstone Creek stood assembled around the gallows, their faces bright with morning sun and dark with expectation. Men held their hats in their hands. Women clutched handkerchiefs. Children peered between adult legs, wide-eyed and curious. Judge Harlan stood on the platform beside the rope, his black coat making him look like a carrion bird against the pale wood. He held the death warrant in his gnarled hands, the paper fluttering slightly in the desert breeze. "Bring her out, Sheriff," the judge called. "It's time." Caldwell walked slowly from the jailhouse, Elena beside him. He had unlocked her chains, but kept them in his hands, the metal links feeling heavier than iron had any right to feel. Elena moved with quiet dignity, her back straight despite everything, her dark dress clean and pressed, the only dress she owned, the one she had worn on her wedding day 3 years ago. The crowd's voices rose as they appeared, a rumble of satisfaction and anticipation. Someone called out, "There's the Black Widow." Another voice added, "Make her pay for what her husband done." But Caldwell noticed that not all the faces in the crowd looked eager. Some appeared troubled, uncertain. Mrs. Patterson stood near the back, her husband beside her, the man whose life Elena had saved with her anonymous warning. As they reached the gallows, Elena stumbled slightly on the wooden steps. Caldwell steadied her with his free hand, and in that moment he made his choice. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur. Judge Harlan frowned. "Sheriff, we have a schedule to keep." "I said wait." Caldwell's voice carried the authority of 20 years wearing the badge. He turned to face the crowd, Elena's diary held against his chest like armor. "Before we proceed, there's something this town needs to hear." A ripple of confusion passed through the assembled people. Judge Harlan's frown deepened. "Sheriff Caldwell, the law is clear. The sentence has been passed. The law," Caldwell said slowly, "is supposed to serve justice. And justice requires truth." He held up the diary so the crowd could see it. "This belonged to Elena Vargas. I found it hidden in her cell last night." "Sheriff," Judge Harlan began. "This is her story," Caldwell continued, opening the diary to the first page. "Written in her own hand. And I think you all deserve to hear what she has to say before we put a rope around her neck." The crowd grew restless. Someone shouted, "We don't want to hear her lies." But Caldwell noticed that Mrs. Patterson had moved closer, and others were following her lead. "These aren't lies," Caldwell said. "These are the words of a woman who was trapped in a nightmare, who did everything she could to fight it, and who saved more lives than any of us will ever know." He began to read, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. The first entry, with its mention of wild roses and hope. Then the second, with its first glimpse of fear. Page by page, he revealed Elena's story. Not the story the town had invented, but the truth written in ink and tears. As he read about Miguel's violence toward his wife, about Elena's desperate attempts to warn potential victims, about her secret correspondence with law enforcement, the crowd began to change. The eager faces grew troubled. The bloodthirsty voices fell silent. When Caldwell read about the Cave Creek raid and how Elena's information had saved lives and recovered stolen gold, Mrs. Patterson stepped forward. "Tom," she called out, her voice shaking. "Tom, remember when I told you not to make that supply run to Tucson? Remember how I said I had a feeling about it?" Her husband nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn on his weathered face. "It wasn't a feeling, Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice growing stronger. "It was her. She warned me. This woman saved your life, and I never even knew her name." A murmur passed through the crowd, uncertainty replacing certainty. Caldwell continued reading, his voice growing hoarse but never faltering. When he reached Elena's final entries, her plans to stop Miguel from attacking the school wagon, several women in the crowd began to weep openly. "She stayed," Caldwell said, closing the diary. "When she could have run, when she could have saved herself, she stayed to protect children she had never met. She chose a certain death over uncertain survival because she couldn't live with innocent blood on her hands." The crowd was silent now, faces turned upward like flowers seeking sun. Even Judge Harlan had lowered his death warrant, his expression troubled. But there's more, Caldwell said. He opened the diary to the very last page, to an entry he had not shared with Elena, one she had written after her capture, but before the trial. His voice broke slightly as he began to read. If anyone reads this, please know that I do not blame this town for condemning me. You have all suffered because of Miguel's crimes, and your anger is righteous. If my death brings you peace, if it helps you heal, then I go to it willingly. I ask only that you remember me not as his wife, but as someone who tried, in her small way, to make amends for the evil done in her name. And please, Caldwell's voice caught, please forgive me for not being brave enough to stop it all sooner. The fault was never yours. It was mine, for staying too long in a darkness I should have fled. The silence that followed was deeper than death itself. In that silence, Elena stepped forward. She's wrong, you know, she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its gentleness. I wrote those words thinking I deserved to die for my cowardice. But Sheriff Caldwell has shown me something I couldn't see before. She looked out over the crowd, meeting eyes that had been hungry for her blood just moments before. I wasn't a coward. I was afraid, yes. Trapped, yes. But I fought back in the only way I could. And maybe that's enough. Mrs. Patterson broke from the crowd and climbed the gallows steps. Without a word, she took Elena's hands in hers. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry we didn't know. I'm sorry we didn't help. You couldn't have known, Elena replied. I made sure of that. One by one, others began to approach. The blacksmith who had lost money in one of Miguel's robberies. The pastor whose church Miguel had burned. The doctor who had treated Miguel's victims. They came not with anger, but with understanding, with shame, with something that looked like reverence for a woman who had fought evil with nothing but ink and paper and desperate courage. Judge Harlan folded the death warrant and put it in his coat pocket. Mrs. Vargas, he said formally, in light of new evidence, this court hereby vacates your sentence. You're free to go. But Elena did not move from the platform. Instead, she looked out over the crowd of people who had gathered to watch her die and were now witnessing her rebirth. I want to stay, she said quietly. This is my home now. These are my people. If you'll have me, if you can forgive me for the sins I couldn't prevent, I want to help rebuild what Miguel destroyed. The crowd's answer came not in words, but in the tears on weathered faces, in the hands reached out to touch her own, in the quiet dignity of people learning that justice and vengeance are not the same thing. As the sun climbed higher and the shadow of the gallows shortened and finally disappeared, Elena Vargas stepped down from the platform not as a condemned woman, but as a survivor. The diary that had nearly been buried with her became the first entry in Tombstone Creek's new chapter, a reminder that truth, however late it arrives, has the power to transform not just individual lives, but the very soul of a community. That evening, as the unused rope was coiled and put away and the gallows stood empty against the sunset, Sheriff Caldwell found Elena sitting by the creek where Miguel had once brought her wild roses. She was writing in a new journal, her pen moving steadily across the page. What are you writing now? He asked. Elena looked up, and for the first time since he had known her, she smiled. The truth, she said. All of it. The good and the bad, the fear and the hope. Someone should write it down, don't you think? Someone should remember how a town learned the difference between justice and revenge, and how sometimes the bravest thing you could do is simply refuse to let evil win. As the stars appeared overhead and the desert settled into peaceful quiet, Elena continued writing, her words flowing like water over stone, washing away the stains of the past and laying the foundation for whatever future lay ahead.